Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In the quiet hours of a June morning in 1992, Springfield, Missouri became the setting for one of America's most baffling mysteries. 3 women, a mother, her daughter, and her daughter's friend, vanished without a trace from a small house on East Delmar Street. Their cars were still parked outside, their purses still sat inside, their beds appeared slept in, but Sherrill Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall had disappeared into thin air, leaving behind a crime scene that would puzzle investigators for decades to come. Tonight, we dive into the perplexing case of the Springfield 3. In the early morning hours of June 7, 1992, in Springfield, Missouri, a seemingly impossible crime occurred that would baffle investigators for decades to come. 3 women, Sherrill Levitt, her daughter Suzanne Streeter, and Suzie's friend Stacy McCall, vanished without a trace from a small single-story house at 1717 East Delmar Street. Their disappearance would become one of the most perplexing missing persons cases in American criminal history, known as the Springfield 3. The evening of June 6th had been one of celebration. Suzanne Streeter and Stacy McCall, both 18 years old, had just graduated from Kickapoo High School. After attending their graduation ceremony and various parties throughout the evening, the 2 friends arrived at Sherrill Levitt's house around 2:15 a.m. on June 7th. Sherrill, a 47-year-old hairdresser, was known to be a protective mother who always kept a watchful eye on her daughter and her friends. The girls had originally planned to spend the night at their friend Janelle Kirby's house, but changed their minds due to overcrowding. They decided to stay at Suzie's house instead, where her mother Sherrill would be. This seemingly mundane decision would become a crucial turning point in their lives. What makes this case particularly haunting is the ordinary nature of the scene investigators found when they arrived. The women's cars were still parked outside. Sherrill's Toyota Corsica and Suzie's Volkswagen Beetle were exactly where they should have been. Their purses, clothing, and other personal belongings remained in the house. The beds appeared to have been slept in, and there were wet towels in the bathroom, suggesting at least some of the women had showered. But there were subtle signs that something was terribly wrong. The glass globe of the porch light had been shattered, with the broken glass carefully swept into a neat pile on the porch. Inside, the answering machine's message tape had been deliberately erased. A painting on the wall was slightly askew. These small details would become significant as investigators tried to piece together what happened that night. The alarm was first raised when Janelle Kirby and her boyfriend Mike Henson arrived at the house around 8 a.m. on June 7th. They had plans to meet Suzie and Stacy to spend the day at a water park in Branson, Missouri. When they knocked on the door, no one answered, though all 3 women's cars were present. They called the house phone repeatedly, but only got the answering machine. Growing concerned, Janelle and Mike entered the unlocked house. Everything looked normal at first glance, but the absence of all 3 women was unsettling. The family dog, a Yorkshire Terrier named Cinnamon, was inside and appeared anxious. More disturbing was the fact that the women's cigarettes, purses, makeup, and clothes were all present, items that would typically be taken if someone had left voluntarily. Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, began calling around when her daughter didn't return home or call by noon. She eventually went to the house herself around 4 p.m. and found the scene exactly as Janelle and Mike had described it hours earlier. It wasn't until 7:30 p.m. that evening that Janice finally called the police to report the women missing. The Springfield Police Department's initial response was somewhat tepid. Missing persons cases typically aren't treated as emergencies in the first 24 hours, especially when involving adults. However, the circumstances were unusual enough that they began an investigation. Unfortunately, by the time police arrived, dozens of worried friends and family members had already been through the house, inadvertently contaminating what would later be recognized as a potential crime scene. The investigation revealed no signs of forced entry except for the broken porch light. No neighbors reported hearing any unusual sounds or disturbances during the night. The women's beds showed signs of having been slept in, and their nightclothes were found in the house. This suggested that whatever happened likely occurred in the early morning hours, possibly after they had gone to bed. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was a series of phone calls received at the house that morning. Several people who called reported hearing the same strange message on the answering machine. The message was described as weird and garbled, though no one could remember the exact content. By the time police arrived, the message had been erased, adding another layer of mystery to the case. The women's personal lives were scrutinized for possible clues. Sherrill Levitt was divorced and worked as a cosmetologist at a local salon. She was well liked by her clients and had no known enemies. Suzanne Streeter had recently testified against an ex-boyfriend in a robbery case, which initially seemed promising as a lead, but ultimately led nowhere. Stacy McCall was planning to attend Southwest Missouri State University in the fall and had no apparent troubles in her life. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. A witness reported seeing a van in the vicinity of the house during the early morning hours, though this lead was never conclusively verified. Another witness claimed to have seen a woman matching Sherrill's description being forced into a van by two men, but this account couldn't be corroborated, and the timing didn't align with other evidence. The case quickly captured national attention. The disappearance of 3 women from a house without any signs of a struggle or significant evidence was unprecedented. The FBI became involved, bringing additional resources and expertise to the investigation. They conducted extensive interviews, analyzed physical evidence, and developed multiple theories about what might have happened. One theory suggested that the women might have been targeted by someone they knew, possibly explaining the lack of forced entry and the apparent calm nature of their initial departure from the house. Another theory proposed that they had encountered someone posing as a law enforcement officer or other authority figure, which might have led them to leave willingly before the situation turned violent. The investigation took a dark turn when police began receiving disturbing tips about possible locations where the women might have been taken. One of the most significant leads came from a woman who claimed her brother-in-law had knowledge of the disappearances. She stated that the women's bodies had been buried in the foundation of the Cox Hospital parking garage, which was under construction at the time they vanished. This tip seemed credible enough that in 2007, crime scene investigators used ground-penetrating radar to examine specific areas of the parking garage. They identified several anomalies in the concrete that could potentially be consistent with human remains. However, hospital administrators were reluctant to approve the extensive demolition required to investigate further, citing both cost and structural concerns. This particular lead remains one of the most tantalizing yet frustrating aspects of the case. Another significant lead emerged when investigators learned of a man named Robert Craig Cox. Cox, a former Army Ranger with a troubled past, had been living in Springfield at the time of the disappearances and working at a local hospital. He had previously been convicted of kidnapping and assault in Florida, though this conviction was later overturned on appeal. More disturbing was his connection to another murder case in Texas, though he was ultimately acquitted of that charge. When questioned about the Springfield 3, Cox provided alibis that initially checked out. However, in 1996, while imprisoned in Texas for other crimes, he made a series of cryptic statements to journalists and investigators. He claimed to know the women were dead and that their bodies would never be found. When pressed for details, Cox would only say that he would reveal everything after his mother's death. This promise remains unfulfilled as Cox continues to serve his sentence in Texas and has not provided any additional information. The investigation also explored possible connections to other crimes in the area. In the months leading up to the disappearances, Springfield had experienced a series of break-ins and sexual assaults. While investigators couldn't establish a definitive link between these crimes and the women's disappearance, the pattern suggested the possibility of an escalating predator in the area. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case was its impact on the victims' families. Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, became a tireless advocate for missing persons and their families. She established One Missing Link, an organization dedicated to helping families of missing persons navigate the complex emotional and practical challenges they face. She spent countless hours following up on leads, conducting interviews, and keeping the case in the public eye. The case also highlighted significant issues in how missing persons cases were handled in the early 1990s. The initial 24-hour waiting period before serious investigation began, the lack of proper crime scene preservation, and the limited coordination between different law enforcement agencies all potentially hampered the investigation. These lessons learned from the Springfield 3 case have helped shape modern protocols for handling missing persons cases. As years passed, investigators continued to receive tips and explore new angles. In 2002, a woman came forward claiming that her ex-husband had been involved in the disappearances. She provided detailed information about locations where evidence might be found, including a farm outside Springfield. Extensive searches were conducted, including the use of cadaver dogs, but no physical evidence was discovered. The role of organized crime was also investigated. Springfield, despite its relatively small size, had connections to larger criminal networks operating throughout the Midwest. Some investigators theorized that the women might have inadvertently witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, leading to their abduction. However, like many other leads in the case, this theory couldn't be substantiated with physical evidence. In 1997, a significant development occurred when a convicted killer named Gerald Carnahan was investigated for possible connections to the case. Carnahan had a history of violent crimes against women in the Springfield area. While in prison for other offenses, he allegedly made statements suggesting knowledge of the women's fate. However, extensive investigation and interviews failed to produce any concrete evidence linking him to the disappearances. The case has also attracted attention from various psychics and paranormal investigators over the years. While law enforcement typically doesn't put much stock in such leads, the desperate nature of the case led them to follow up on some of these tips. One psychic claimed the women were buried near a hospital, eerily similar to the later tip about the Cox Hospital parking garage. Another claimed they were hidden in a cave system in the Ozarks, leading to several extensive but fruitless searches. The Springfield Police Department maintains an active file on the case, and it remains one of their highest priority cold cases. They continue to receive tips and leads, though the frequency has diminished over the years. A dedicated team of investigators periodically reviews the case file, applying new investigative techniques and technologies as they become available. DNA technology, which was in its infancy when the women disappeared, has advanced significantly since 1992. Investigators have preserved various pieces of physical evidence from the house, hoping that future technological developments might provide new insights. However, the contamination of the crime scene in those crucial first hours continues to hamper these efforts. The investigation took another interesting turn in the early 2000s, when investigators began exploring potential connections to the deaths of other young women in Missouri during the same time period. While no direct links were established, the pattern analysis helped develop new perspectives on the case. investigators particularly focused on similarities with disappearances in other Midwest towns where women were taken in groups, though none matched the unique circumstances of 3 women vanishing from a house without signs of a significant struggle. A lesser-known aspect of the case involves a series of anonymous letters received by local media outlets between 1993 and 1995. These letters, never released in full to the public, allegedly contained details about the crime that only the perpetrator would know. However, after extensive analysis, investigators determined that most of these letters were likely written by attention seekers rather than anyone with genuine knowledge of the crime. The case also drew attention from retired FBI profilers who suggested that the crime required significant planning and likely involved multiple perpetrators. They pointed to several key factors: the ability to control 3 adult women simultaneously, the careful cleaning of the crime scene, and the complete disappearance of all 3 victims. The profilers suggested that at least one of the perpetrators might have had law enforcement or military training, given the sophistication of the crime. In 2015, a new development emerged when a former Springfield resident came forward with an intriguing account. They claimed to have overheard a conversation in a local bar shortly after the disappearances, where several men were discussing details about the women that hadn't been made public. While this lead was thoroughly investigated, including multiple interviews and polygraph tests, it ultimately failed to produce concrete evidence. The impact on the Springfield community has been profound and lasting. The house at 1717 East Delmar Street became a sort of unofficial memorial, with people regularly leaving flowers and notes. The property changed hands several times over the years, with each new owner dealing with the burden of its tragic history. Local schools began using the case as a teaching tool for personal safety, and the community developed new neighborhood watch programs in response to the tragedy. Suzie Streeter's brother, Bart Streeter, has been particularly vocal about maintaining public interest in the case. In numerous interviews over the years, he's expressed frustration with the various theories and false leads that have emerged. He's been especially critical of psychics and amateur sleuths who have sometimes caused more harm than good by promoting unsubstantiated theories or harassing potential witnesses. One of the more controversial aspects of the investigation involves the handling of physical evidence from the scene. In addition to the contamination issues, some evidence was accidentally destroyed during a flood at a police storage facility in 1996. While copies of documents and photographs were preserved, some physical items were lost, potentially limiting future forensic testing opportunities. The Cox Hospital parking garage theory continues to generate significant debate within the law enforcement community. Some investigators believe that the ground-penetrating radar results were compelling enough to warrant further investigation, regardless of the cost and complexity involved. Others argue that the tip about the garage was one of many similar leads that couldn't be substantiated, and that focusing too much attention on it might divert resources from more promising avenues of investigation. In 2008, a retired Springfield detective who had worked the case from the beginning shared some previously undisclosed details about the investigation. He revealed that several items from the house, including a piece of carpet and some bedding, had shown traces of blood when tested with luminol. However, due to the limitations of forensic technology at the time and the contamination of the scene, investigators were unable to determine if this blood evidence was related to the disappearances or had some innocent explanation. The case has also highlighted the complex relationship between law enforcement and the media in missing persons cases. While media coverage was crucial in keeping the case in the public eye, it sometimes complicated the investigation. False reports and speculation occasionally led witnesses to doubt or alter their memories of events, and some potential sources of information became reluctant to come forward due to fear of media exposure. One of the most persistent theories involves the possibility that the women were targeted due to Suzanne Streeter's testimony in the robbery case against her ex-boyfriend. While this angle was thoroughly investigated at the time, new information emerged in the late 1990s about potential connections between the robbery suspect and organized crime figures in Kansas City. These connections were extensively investigated, but ultimately led to another dead end. The Springfield Police Department's Cold Case Unit has made several attempts to apply modern investigative techniques to the case. They've used advanced computer modeling to reconstruct the crime scene and analyze possible scenarios for how 3 women could have been taken from the house without alerting neighbors. They've also created detailed timelines incorporating cell phone tower data that wasn't available during the original investigation, though the limited nature of cellular technology in 1992 has restricted the usefulness of this approach. The investigation also benefited from advances in behavioral analysis. FBI specialists who reviewed the case in the 2010s developed a new theory about the perpetrator's profile. They suggested that the crime's execution, particularly the cleaning of the crime scene and the careful handling of evidence, indicated someone with a higher level of education and social functioning than initially believed. This contrasted with earlier profiles that had focused more on the likelihood of a disorganized, opportunistic offender. The case took another turn when investigators began exploring potential connections to a series of bank robberies in the Springfield area during the early 1990s. Several of these robberies demonstrated unusual sophistication, and there were rumors that some bank employees had been threatened with harm to their families to ensure cooperation. While no direct link to the Springfield Three was ever established, the timeline and methodology suggested the possibility of organized criminal activity in the area during that period. In 2012, a former prison inmate came forward with information about conversations he'd had with another prisoner who claimed knowledge of the disappearances. According to this source, the women had been targeted as part of a drug-related intimidation scheme that had gone wrong. While investigators found the information credible enough to warrant follow-up, extensive interviews and searches failed to corroborate the account. The case has also highlighted the evolution of forensic science over the decades. In 2017, investigators began using advanced DNA extraction techniques on preserved evidence from the house. These methods, capable of obtaining DNA profiles from severely degraded samples, offered new hope for identifying potential suspects. While the results of these tests remain confidential, sources close to the investigation indicate that several new genetic profiles were obtained, though matching them to potential suspects has proved challenging. The psychological impact on the investigators themselves has been significant. Several officers who worked the case have spoken about how it affected their careers and personal lives. One detective, who spent over 15 years on the case before retiring, described it as the one that haunts me. He noted that the complete lack of bodies or crime scene evidence made it particularly difficult to process, both professionally and emotionally. The case has also become a focal point for discussions about missing persons investigations in general. Law enforcement agencies across the country have studied the Springfield 3 case as an example of both what to do and what to avoid in similar investigations. The initial response, evidence handling, and long-term investigation management have all provided valuable lessons for modern police work. In recent years, attention has turned to the possibility that the women's disappearance might be connected to other unsolved crimes in the Ozarks region. Investigators have identified several cases from the same time period involving missing women or unsolved murders that share certain characteristics with the Springfield 3 case. While no definitive connections have been established, the pattern analysis has opened new avenues for investigation. The advent of social media has brought both benefits and challenges to the investigation. While platforms like Facebook and Twitter have helped keep the case in the public eye and generated new tips, they've also become breeding grounds for conspiracy theories and unsubstantiated rumors. Investigators have had to dedicate significant resources to sorting through social media-generated leads, most of which proved to be dead ends. The case has also attracted attention from true crime podcasters and documentary filmmakers. While some of these projects have helped generate new leads, others have been criticized for sensationalizing the tragedy or promoting unverified theories. The victims' families have expressed mixed feelings about this attention, acknowledging its value in maintaining public awareness while struggling with the emotional toll of seeing their loved one's story repeatedly dissected in the media. In 2019, advances in ground-penetrating radar technology led to renewed interest in the Cox Hospital parking garage theory. Modern equipment, capable of providing much more detailed subsurface imaging than was available in 2007, identified several additional anomalies in the structure. However, the same challenges regarding structural integrity and cost have continued to prevent a full investigation of these findings. The Springfield Police Department has maintained a dedicated tip line for the case, which still receives several calls each month. While most of these tips rehash previously investigated leads, investigators maintain that it only takes one solid piece of information to break the case open. They continue to encourage anyone with information, no matter how seemingly insignificant, to come forward. The passage of time has brought both new challenges and opportunities to the investigation. In 2020, investigators began utilizing artificial intelligence software to analyze patterns in the thousands of tips received over the years. This technology has helped identify previously overlooked connections and has generated several new leads that investigators continue to pursue. One particularly intriguing development came from the analysis of cell phone records from 1992. Although cellular technology was limited at the time, investigators discovered that several key witnesses had given slightly different accounts of their whereabouts during crucial hours. Modern analysis techniques applied to these discrepancies have opened new avenues of investigation, particularly regarding the timeline of events between 2:15 a.m. and sunrise on June 7th. The case has also benefited from advances in forensic genealogy, similar to the techniques used to solve the Golden State Killer case. In 2021, investigators began working with genetic genealogists to analyze DNA profiles obtained from evidence preserved from the house. While this work is ongoing, it represents one of the most promising new approaches to the case in recent years. The impact on Springfield's collective memory remains profound. Local schools now include the case in their curriculum when teaching personal safety and community awareness. The disappearance has become part of the city's cultural fabric, with many residents able to recall exactly where they were when they first heard the news. Annual vigils continue to draw hundreds of participants, demonstrating the community's ongoing commitment to finding answers. The families of the missing women have shown remarkable resilience throughout the decades-long ordeal. Janice McCall, in particular, has continued her advocacy work through One Missing Link, helping countless other families of missing persons. Her organization has been instrumental in pushing for legislative changes regarding how missing persons cases are handled in Missouri and nationwide. In 2022, the Springfield Police Department established a new cold case unit with enhanced technological capabilities and dedicated funding. The Springfield 3 case was designated as a priority, with new investigators bringing fresh perspectives to the evidence. They've begun using advanced data analytics to re-examine old leads and identify potential patterns that might have been missed in earlier investigations. One of the most significant recent developments has been the use of advanced sonar technology to examine local waterways and underground cave systems that weren't thoroughly searched in the initial investigation. While these searches haven't yet yielded physical evidence, they've helped eliminate several locations that had long been subjects of speculation. The case continues to generate new theories and leads, even after 3 decades. Each year brings new technological advances that offer hope for eventually solving this haunting mystery. The Springfield Police Department maintains that the case will never be closed until the women are found and their families receive the answers they've sought for so long. The disappearance of the Springfield Three remains one of America's most perplexing missing persons cases, a reminder that even in the modern age of surveillance and forensic science, it's still possible for 3 people to vanish without a trace. Their story continues to resonate with people across the country, serving as both a cautionary tale and a call to remain vigilant in the search for justice. For the families of Sherrill Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall, the search for answers continues. As Janice McCall often says, someone, somewhere knows something. Until that someone comes forward or new evidence emerges, the mystery of what happened on that June night in 1992 remains unsolved but never forgotten.